Well, good evening, everyone. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce a new lecturer to Lockdown. He's not a new lecturer to me. In fact, on and off, we've known each other for about 35 years, I think, Charles. He was educated at UCL. He did his MA at London. He's lectured widely in Jewish history and comparative religion. Also, he's led tours all over Central and Eastern Europe, Iberia. He writes for newspapers and journals, and he's one of the best Jewish historians I've ever heard. So, Charles, welcome so much to Lockdown. And tonight, it's a rather dark subject, but an essential subject. He's going to lecture to us on the blood libel legend. So again, welcome to Lockdown.
Thank you very much, Trudy. And welcome to everyone who, good morning or good evening, and welcome to England. And I suppose it would be quite fitting to start the subject of blood libels as its origin within the last 1,000 years is within England. Of all the most perverse accusations against Jews is the blood libel. And it comes under the general heading of ritual murder, as we will come back to both of them. Now, one of the major works on blood libels is in the area of psychohistory by a lady known as Rappaport from Vienna Medical School and a survivor of Buchenwald. And it is written, of all the bizarre charges against the Jewish people, the one that enjoyed the hardest tenacity and the utmost notoriety and has produced the direst consequences is the so-called ritual murder accusation. Medieval Christians, and some modern ones too, believe that Christian children were seized and tortured to death during the Passover season. Now, it's very interesting that all the accusations against Jews would be this one against blood and about blood. Incredibly, if we move on to the next slide, there we will see where blood is mentioned in the Torah. Now, in ancient days, there were those who believed that blood had a special quality and they would use blood in great amounts. Judaism shows within the Torah, within the Bible, also many areas to do with blood, such as Joseph's coat being dipped in blood, Moses turning the Nile to blood, blood is posted on the doorposts during the 10th plague, there is sprinkling of blood during the sacrificial rite. Prophets then speak out against partaking of blood. Nachmanides, the great Spanish rabbi, is against eating blood. And this progressed all the way to today, as many people will know, that even a drop of blood in an egg is totally rejected. Bildhauer, a scholar of St. Andrews, had written a book entitled Medieval Blood about medieval European conceptions of blood. And in it, she writes, blood has extraordinary prominence in medieval Europe. For example, in the Eucharist, in Christ's Passion, Christ's blood was regarded as exceptional. And so we have this bizarre situation whereby Jews are somehow associated with the desire to consume blood. But at the same time, if you look at the sentences on the slide in front of you, it says from Genesis, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in God's image did God make man. And then in the book of Leviticus, it goes on much more to reject any concept of eating blood. It is a law for all time throughout the ages in all your settlements. You must not eat any fat or any blood. And again, and you must not consume any blood, either of a bird or of an animal in any of your settlements. Anyone who eats blood shall be cut off. And in Leviticus 19, you shall not eat anything with its blood. You shall not practice divination or soothsaying. And finally, in Deuteronomy, when I say finally, it's one of many, many sentences in the Bible, make sure that you do not partake of the blood, for the blood is the life, and you must not consume the life with the flesh. So how could it be that with such an abhorrence of eating, drinking, or having blood in any way consumed, that we would be consumed with the accusation that we somehow indulge ourselves in killing children to have their blood. And the story starts of the last 1,000 years in England, William of Norwich. If you went to one part of England, Norwich, a fairly uneventful place, actually, nothing very special. But there I once visited, and in going to the cathedral there in Norwich, I tapped an official of the church on the shoulder and I said, and he just turned around, he looked at me and he said, "It never happened." And yet, in many ways, of course, it never did. The modern ritual murder charge, which is what William of Norwich really was, is the idea of killing Christ over and over again, and often associated with the period of Passover, which we've just been celebrating. But some of the writings of the ritual murder are also associated with the taking of blood from William, and that was needed. Now, the idea came about because it was believed and written about many years after 1144 that Jews got together, the hierarchy of the Jewish world, at some part in Narbonne in Europe, and there they decided which city was going to have which culprit killed by the Jews, and the Jews were going to take their blood. 1144, according to Thomas of Monmouth, who was the writer who wrote 4 years after the events, that this was the place chosen for the death of William. He was informed many years later, so he wasn't there at the time, and well, nobody was really there at the time, by an apostate, Theobald of Cambridge. And this brings to the front the idea of when incidents happened involving Jews, as we'll see later, we're on other subjects as well, that often apostates are the ones who would inform on their own people. Now, it is said that William was crucified, and William's body was found on Saturday, the 25th of March in 1144. The legend turned into a cult, with William acquiring the status of a martyr and a relic, so that people would flock to Norwich in order to see the tomb of William. What mattered most was not the victim, but the identity of the killers. It didn't matter whether it was William, or we'll see in many other places, other people. The main issue was who killed William. And it is said again and again and again that it was the Jews. So you have to ask yourself the question, how is it that Jews were picked on to be the accused of killing these children and taking their blood or reenacting the crucifixion of Jesus Christ? Some would say that during the Crusades, which took place just before the date we can see in front of us, that was a period of the First and Second Crusades, that Christians had seen Jews killing their own and often killing their children to avoid being forced into Christianity. Thus, having seen Jews killing their own, it was a natural extension to believe that Jews could kill other people as well, especially Christians. On the occasion of William of Norwich, there was no real evidence that there had been a ritual murder. There was no evidence that any blood had been taken. They were associated with the crime, but he was never made into a saint, and the issue of William of Norwich tended to disappear from history. Now, you might think that the truth of these things would be enacted and propelled by the church itself. And yes, talking about popes, who one just heard yesterday, here we have Pope Innocent IV on 1247, a papal bull, where he's talking about the Jews, and he writes, as does Gregory X as well, a letter against the blood libel. And he quotes, "And most falsely do these Christians claim that the Jews have secretly and furtively carried away these children and killed them, and that the Jews offer sacrifice from the heart and blood of these children, since their law in this matter precisely and expressly forbid Jews to sacrifice, eat, or drink the blood. You would have thought, with papal statements and papal bulls and popes standing up on behalf of the Jews, this matter would have died away. William of Norwich may have died away, but in fact, it didn't. And once the virus began to spread, it didn't stop, and it would spread, as we'll see, around the world. There in England, a matter of a few years later, 1255, is one of the most famous incidents of blood libel accusations. And little St. Hugh of Lincoln, who's certainly not known as a saint any longer, not accepted in that way, there, in this case, there were trials of the Jews. In the case of William, there was no trial. Nobody was found guilty. Nobody was put to death for this non-existent killing of William. But here in the case of little St. Hugh of Lincoln in 1255, an 8-year-old child, as he was, disappeared at Lincoln in 1255. His body was found, as so often they were in the medieval period, down wells, in rivers, in mud. The care for children was not that great amongst the Christian population, or maybe any other. And a Jew confessed, as always, there was a Jew who would confess under pressure or not, to involvement. He confessed to a relative of the Bishop of Lincoln, and he said that the boy had been crucified by the Jews at the time. King Henry III, who was the king at the time, had Copin, the man accused of having killed Hugh, of being executed. 91 Jews were arrested and sent to London, and 18 of them were executed. Now we begin to have a new idea in this awfulness of the blood libel, is that Jews were not only arrested, forced to confess, but were also being put to death, even though they were completely innocent in all respects. As was usual, of course, as with William, they were seen as a person that miracles would that saintly things would happen and miracles would happen, and the body was found. It had nothing to do, he wasn't necessarily killed. The cathedral erected a shrine, as you can see on the left of the slide, commemorating the miracles of Hugh, and the body was honorably buried in the church of Lincoln as it had been the corpse of a precious martyr. Doubt always existed that Hugh was never canonized, just as William wasn't, nor was Hugh. The Vatican refused to have him in their role of Catholic martyrs. Now you can see from the opinion of the Pope just before, you can understand how that would be. Eventually, and if you went there, if you visit Lincoln today, you'll see that the shrine is on the right side. And there you have there just an explanation of this story. And of course, it was completely untrue, as stated in the plaque next to the reduced size element in the cathedrals we have it. But again, the legend stuck. And why let truth get in the way of a good story? This would extend not only to the location of where these things had happened, but those in art would take it up. Those such as Geoffrey Chaucer would write about it. And the painting here is by well, you can see it there, Edward Coley Burne-Jones, who was a pre-Raphaelite painter, a classic painting there, who existed in the 19th century. And he recreates the painting of the story told by Geoffrey Chaucer. And Geoffrey Chaucer, of course, is one of the all-time greats of English literature, who wrote something called The Prioress's Tale. It is a completely anti-Jewish poem. And yet, Chaucer actually lived in a period of time where there were no Jews living in England. They'd been thrown out. The Prioress's Tale tells a tragic story, and you can see there in the painting, of a little boy, aged 7, who had a fondness for singing hymns whilst walking to and from school. The child is depicted in the grey clothing. Within the painting, he is martyred because of his singing. On the right is the Virgin Mary, wearing blue as she often would, who praises the boy for his singing of his hymns, took pity on the dying child, allowed that he should continue singing, and then a grain is inserted into his mouth, and when the grain is removed, he dies. Geoffrey Chaucer then writes, "From thenceforth the Jews there conspired, the innocent from out this world to chase. A murderer to serve this end they hired, who in an alley had a private place, and as a child passed by at a pace, this wretched Jew caught and held him fast, and cut his throat, and in the pit him cast." So we can see now how the story is developing, and it's not only localized, but it's in part a parcel of English literature to be read by all and sundry. The legend continues on. We now come to Simon of Trent, that's in Italy, in 1475. We've moved out of England, and we now come on to Italy. This is one of the most famous illustrations to occur on the issue of the blood libel. If you look at much literature for the last 500, 600, 700 years, you will see this picture, because this picture says it all. If you look at this picture in front of you, there every single individual is identified as a Jew. They are all Jews because they have on their chests, they have the Ruel. You can see that around yellow circle, which was classic actually of France, but in other places as well. And that would be worn as a Jew badge, which had been introduced by the church. On the case of the man, there has a Jew hat on the left side of the picture. That is a classic German identity of the Jew badge. And the Jews there, each and every one of them are doing the awful thing of cutting as Christ was cut. You can see there's one cutting into the chest of the baby. Here's a bit more than a baby, but it's a baby. And they're cutting into him, and they are literally sucking the blood out of the child and be collected into a basin. What more could you ever want to see? And this is in the illustration, as you can see, at the end of the 15th century. Now, Simon of Trent was aged 2. So you can see that the depiction of Simon as a rather older child is a bit, anachronistic, but he was aged 2. And his father alleged that he'd been kidnapped and murdered by the local Jewish community. Again, the occurrence was at Easter time. Always Easter was a dangerous time when the Jews would reenact the crucifixion of Jesus, and they would take blood, which they stated would be needed for matzahs. Jews and matzahs, Jews and matzahs, Jews and red wine all go together. At this time, Jews were arrested. 15 local Jews were sentenced to death and were all burnt at the stake. They had a way of burning at the stake because there was a Christian legal consideration that you shouldn't kill people by shedding blood, and thus you would burn them at the stake. A papal bull, actually coming back to the Pope, said a legal trial had taken place, stating the awfulness of a ritual murder trial and that it couldn't have possibly have taken place. But Simon was regarded as a saint, although again, just as with William, just as with little St. Hugh, he was actually never canonized by the church, and any martyrology to do with him was removed in that famous period of 1965 under Pope Paul VI. Now, the cartographer and the illustrator here was writing that image which you saw there in around 1493. But the image of Simon begins to spread. And from England, we now move to Germany. And above the top, you can see their little things being held together, on which of this top of this image would be Simon of Trent. He's actually being laid there in an image which is on a bridge tower, Bruchenturm, a bridge tower. And this is from what is known as Jews in Christian art, the old bridge tower of Frankfurt. And here we have one of the most awful images, again, anti-Jewish images to take place around the matter of Simon Trent, who is now associated with the German idea, you tend to see these in Germany, of a Judensau, which is a Jew pig, where the Jews are shown with the circle on them, the ruel. You can see that they're riding on a sow backwards. There is a Jew suckling the teats of the cow, of the sow underneath. You have the devil with a Jew badge, and you have a Jew on his knees who is licking the anus of the animal. And you couldn't get more revolting and foul than this. You would think, wouldn't you? And yet, this is the 18th century. And then we come to the image of the 21st century. This has now spread to be the most grotesque manifestation of anti-Jewish imagery, which is just produced a few years ago, 900 years or whatever it is, since William of Norwich and the accusation of a blood libel. It is still going on in modern Italy. The painting is written by Gasparo, as it says there, and it is a subject of this, what they would call now fake news. Says, you just look at it and you can see the imagery is absolutely revolting. You can see typical Jewish images. They've now got the new noses. They've now got the hats of the Hasidim. They've got payot of the Hasidim, and the Jews are looking the worst image that you would see in Germany from 80 years ago. Simon Wiesenthal Center said about this image, this Italian artist decided to promote this violent, lurid, and long denied slander against Jews through his art. We asked Facebook not to make their platform available for a forgery that has led to the killing and maiming of many Jews for hundreds of years, as we've just been seeing, and use the manual. They should not be using the manual of the typical anti-Semite. The Jew is dirty, slimy. You could even see one of them, the image more or less in the center of somebody holding a syringe, bring it up to date. The Jew is dirty, slimy, thirsty for innocent blood, driven by a phony religion. Those men carry out the mysterious Jews dressed in ritual robes and topped with a lit menorah. The greedy, you can see the menorah in the top right-hand corner. This just imagery, we now have it in art, in literature, illustrations, the poetry of Chaucer. It is just widespread. It is a virus gone mad. And ultimately, it goes on to be seen in the history of 1476 by Tiberius, who continues on this idea of a complete book. He writes a complete book about the passion and death of children. And his writings are thought by many, where he calls for the eradication of Judaism in the Christian world, is thought to be a precursor of the Christian roots of Nazism. But on its spread. And we come to one of the most famous out of Spain. This, of course, is the Spanish world, which is just prior to the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. Since 1391, or thereabout, there have been riots against the Jews, forced conversions, and a large number of what we would call conversos, those who became new Christians. Some would call them Marranos. And Christopher of Toledo, also known as Christopher of LaGuardia, or the Holy Child of LaGuardia, was a 4-year-old Christian boy, again, supposedly, you see him on the cross, supposedly murdered by Jews as well. the actual of this existence of the child is heavily denied. And most people think he actually never existed. But it didn't stop, even though he never existed. There was a forced confession, and this comes to be the Spanish most famous blood libel. There was a confession that it had actually taken place, although there was never a body. There was no blood libel or no blood taken at all. It is thought generally that this idea was to force, this is 1491, the year before the Jews were expelled from Spain, that it was an action in order to force the church and royalty to force the Jews out of Spain as they would 1 year later. And that is the fame of this particular story, where there is no body ever found. Now, in 1840, we now move that it has spread from Europe into the Arab world. And here we have a famous painting, which is known for about the Damascus affair. Now, in February 1840 in Damascus, a Catholic monk and his servant just disappeared. Usually, when it comes to ritual murder charges and blood libels, we're talking about young children, but it doesn't always apply, and there are differences. And this one, again, is different. So you can begin to apply it in lots of different cases. Here, these are two adults that disappear. And the accusation is of ritual murder against members of the Damascus Jewish community, which it was stated in the writings of the Christian community that they needed blood to make their matzahs. The Jews, again, were tortured, and they confessed. News of the imprisonment, however, on this occasion, and the torture of the Jews spread around the world. Here, this painting is by Moritz Oppenheimer, an artist well worth looking into his paintings. He was absolutely classic German painter of the Jewish scenes. Sir Moses Montefiore of Great Britain and Adolphe Crémieux of France were outraged and themselves traveled to Egypt, from where Damascus was controlled, to get an acquittal. By then, it was too late, and many of the people had actually been tortured to death. Mobs attacked the Jews, Torah scrolls were ripped apart, and eventually, only eventually, did the Sultan come out with a statement saying, "We cannot permit the Jewish nation whose innocence is evident." Is there anywhere it didn't occur? 1882 now, Hungary, Tisa Ezra. Now, this is a blood libel well written about in all books to do with Hungary. It was a village where a 14-year-old Christian girl known as Esther Solmosi disappeared at Easter time, as was common. The Jews were accused by the girl's mother. It's all written about, you read about it. And a witness for the prosecution was a 5-year-old son of the shamash of the shul, Joseph Schaff. This little child was used as the main witness to the murder of this girl. Now, this girl has never been found. And in fact, when a girl was found in the river and the mother claimed that it could have been, or others claimed it could have been actually this girl that had disappeared, with the picture on that slide, she was too old. It couldn't have been her. She was 20. And one of the main causes, this was one of the main causes of the rise of anti-Semitism. The child who claimed he saw that two people took this little girl into the synagogue. There he was attacked, the child was attacked, or the girl was attacked, blood was drawn out, and he's seen all of this through a keyhole. This case of 1882 is the first case which they actually used scientific research in order to discover the truth that it had not been possible. Nobody could have seen anything through a keyhole, and this was not possible that it happened in the way that it was assumed. As a result, however, of this led to an incredible rise in anti-Semitism, which is now the word used by the 1880s, in anti-Semitism in Hungary, spreading to Germany as well. And as a result, the leader of the political party that went against the Jews formed what is known as the First International Congress of Anti-Semites. And that was Hungary. Is there nowhere left alone? Kishinev is one of the most famous places in Jewish modern history for all the wrong reasons. It is also because of when it occurred prior to the First World War, you could say in a quiet time of the press, because the numbers killed were not that great, is the most widely known pogrom of the 20th century up to the Second World War. It was famous and caused the death of many Jews, directly and indirectly. It was immortalized in the poetry of Nachman Chaim Bialik. And here the slide is where you can see, for those of you that can read in the Hebrew or the Yiddish, it is Kishinev Shechita. It is a Kishinev slaughter elegy, and it's a musical composition. And the most popular newspaper in Kishinev at the time, the Russian language anti-Semitic newspaper, regularly published articles calling for the death to Jews and crusade against the hated race. Then Mikhail Rybashenko was found murdered in a small town 40 kilometers from Kishinev. And a girl nearby had committed suicide by poisoning herself. There is no connection between the two. There's not even a connection to the Jews. And declared dead, however, in a Jewish hospital. The newspaper, the anti-Semitic newspaper, insinuated that both children had been murdered by the Jewish community for the purpose of using their blood in the preparation of matzah. Similar insinuations. These allegations would produce one of the most famous pogroms in Jewish history, the Kishinev pogrom. As we can see, today's in Moldova, then the capital of Bessarabia, and the 19th to the 21st of April in 1903. During the pogrom, which began on Easter Day, that recommended time for killing Jews, 49 Jews were killed, including young children, as you can see. 92 were gravely injured, 500 were lightly injured, and 1,500 homes were damaged, all because of an accusation that Jews had bled children in order to get their blood to make matzah. American Jews began large-scale financial help and assisted in the emigration of Jews out of there. The incident focused worldwide attention on the persecution of Jews within the Russian Empire, yet a second pogrom still took place. This is a famous print by Ephraim Lillian, who produced this, and in honor of the Kishinev martyrs, as it said, to those who died al Kiddush Hashem, who died for the sanctification of the divine name in Kishinev. And the imagery of the person who is dying with flames at the bottom, you can see wrapped, it looks like in a talit, in ropes, holding a Sefer Torah, or a man going round. He'd been kissed by an angel, and he is being burnt at the stake. Now, interestingly enough, coming out of America, this is the worldwide response to the pogroms. The coverage of the pogrom was greater than any pogrom had been. It wasn't the first pogrom. There have been many pogroms since 1881. But this got worldwide attention. And here is a cartoon, I suppose it is, showing the US President Theodore Roosevelt telling the Tsar, stop the cruel oppression of the Jews. But it didn't. Very few things did. This is the Mendel Baylis affair of 1913. again, Mendel Baelish, you can read about it, was a Russian Jew who worked in a brick factory, accused of the ritual murder in Kiev. And there was a famous trial, the Baelish trial, where he was found innocent of having killed a child for his blood. And although Bayliss was acquitted, he eventually fled, and he would die in America, and he would be buried in the same cemetery as Leo Frank, another Jew who had died, not for the same sort of reason, but in another incident, in another case in America at that time. Now, the Bayliss, if any of you want to actually read about it, of course, is in Bernard Malama's 1966 novel, The Fixer, which, of course, was made famously into a film. I wouldn't recommend the film, I'd recommend the book. And then finally, we come on to the culmination of blood libels, which is where the Nazi Party then took it over, as you can see. The rise of the Nazi Party, especially Julius Streicher, was the founder of the virulently anti-Semitic paper Der Stürmer. In this rag, this nasty, vindictive, revolting, that even Hitler himself on times thought that Streicher was going too far, promulgated the blood libel. What better way of causing people having hatred of the Jews, to have hatred of the Jews, than to depict them as being involved in blood libels, which by now in 1934 have been going on, as we said, from 1144, you can work that out, 800 years. In 1929, there was the Jewish Veterans League challenged the Sturm, and they were actually put on trial against it. And the Judensins unser Unglück, excuse my German pronunciation, which was a loathing of Ostjuden, of Eastern European Jews. There was a great Nuremberg ritual murder trial where Streicher poured out false Talmudic statements showing that Jews condoned ritual murder. The defense, it went on, and Streicher himself was found guilty, and he received more publicity than he could have ever wanted. In the famous Der Stürmer, what is awful, that if you want, you can see here in this depiction again of the blood libel, Jüdische Mordplan, the Jewish murder plan, of all the places that you could look to see a complete list of all the blood libels from 1144 to then, you would look at Der Stürmer, because that's what they put on. And it's actually called here at the top, you can see in the banner, ritual murder number. And it goes on further. The ritual murder, you can see the basis of that one is very much like the Trent, Simon of Trent. 2,000 years of terror is right. This is what Der Stürmer writes, 2,000 years of terror, the compilation of Jewish ritual murders from before the time of Christ until 1932. Let us end. Let us end. In America. Surely not in America. But there is no end to the spread. Once something starts, it doesn't take long to grow again in another area. And then in this, the Golden Medina, where Jews fled for the safety and the purity and the wonder of what the American country was going to be, there are two cases are mentioned from the earliest 20th century. Now, I already mentioned about Leo Frank, but that's out of our area. In 1919, Harris Kahn ran a dry goods company in a Polish enclave in South Chicago. The crowd demanded that the Jews, mainly Poles, that the Jews hand back a Polish boy where the Jews were accused of killing him for, and we all know it by now, his blood that was being used to make matzahs. In this case, and it wasn't the first case, because we've seen it before, there was actually no missing child at all. There was no child. And eventually, there's rioting and threatening Poles were arrested. 17 Poles were arrested and put on trial. The Poles were found guilty. And this was part of the enmity that the Poles felt towards the Jews that they'd felt in Poland. It had merely transferred itself from one land all the way over to America. In 1928, the Jews of Messina, which is in New York State, a little known place, it's of little consequence, and even today, it doesn't inspire you with any great attention. There was an accusation here in America of Jews accused of kidnapping and killing a 4-year-old Christian girl. Again, we've seen sometimes it's a boy, sometimes it's a girl, sometimes it's nobody, sometimes it's an adult, but always this idealized, from their point of view, concept of killing Christian children for the sake of blood. The rabbi of the community exclaimed to the police and the mayor that they should be ashamed of themselves to even ask about such lies and libels. Later in the day, on this occasion, the girl was found. She just wandered off and she came back home. The mayor wrote an apology in 1928 in Messina, in New York State. In light of the solemn protest of my Jewish neighbors, I feel I ought to express clearly and equivocally my sincere regret that by any act of commission or omission, I should have seemed to lend any form of countenance to what I should have known to be a cruel libel, imputing human sacrifice as a practice now or at any time in the history of the Jewish people. We have the popes in the 13th century. We have a mayor in the 20th century, all appealing against the nonsense of the blood libel. And still it went on. And today still it goes on heavily in the Arab world as well. If you read much of the literature coming out of the Arab world, whether it be anywhere from Egypt to Syria, to Iraq, to Iran, to Gaza, you see all the time this idea that the Jews, you've seen more than once, are trying to kill children in order to take their blood. And it is nearly now 1,000 years since William of Norwich. And today, just as anti-Semitism never seems to go away, the blood libel never seems to go away. Jonathan Sacks, the well-known, it's associated, he wrote in the Haggadah, and there's a certain irony in being written in the Haggadah when we're talking about this. Of course, because there were two accusations, the Jews needed blood for the matzah, and the Jews needed blood to make red wine. And that's why, even in the 15th century, there were periods of Jewish history where they were advised against drinking red wine because of the dangers that non-Jews may accuse them of having done that, that it would contain Christian blood. Said Jonathan Sacks, as I end, I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth. As the dust of the earth is from one end to the other, so your children will be dispersed from one end of the world to the other. As dust is trodden by all, so your children will be trod upon by the peoples of the world. As dust outlives all vessels of metal and endures forever, so other nations of the world will cease to be, while Israel will endure forever. And that comes from a rabbinic writings of many, many centuries ago. So on that point, and rather depressing subject, I end, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Monty Golden makes a comment on one of your earlier slides. In the Pale of Settlement, a Jewish woman made borscht, left it in a bowl on the table to cool. When her Gentile servant appeared, she looked in the bowl and said, "Is this the blood that you use to make unleavened bread?" So there's no question here, but she's making this comment.
Yes, I mean, that's quite possible. The idea of borscht doesn't particularly come up much, but any of these things are possible. You can believe whatever you want to believe. And when it came to Jews during the Middle Ages and onwards, if you wanted something as strong and powerful as this blood libel legend, you could believe whatever you want, unfortunately.
Joan asks, did you say there was a pogrom in Moldova?
Yes, as Kishinev.
Okay.
Was known as Moldova today. That then would be Kishinev. It wasn't Moldova then. In fact, it's interesting, I met somebody yesterday when I was away speaking in Cyprus, actually, that somebody was from Moldova and he knew nothing of the history of Kishinev. It was not in his thinking.
David Harris asks, one of the points about the prioress's tale is that it is a tale of violence told by a nun who should be a woman of peace and charity. Is there any evidence to suggest that Chaucer himself was anti-Semitic, or was he just reflecting the context of the times?
Yeah, that is a particularly interesting question. And this question gets asked about the writings of Shakespeare, Merchant of Venice. It gets asked about Dickens and his attitude towards Jews, and it gets asked about Chaucer. You could argue on the one hand that there is little evidence that these people were strongly anti-Jewish, but they absorbed the general trend, which is the Jew was often used as the bad guy in literature. They were the awful one. And so when they came to speak about people who were less deserving and who were evil, then it was natural to pick on the Jew. Whether there were no Jews living here at the time, whether Chaucer was particularly anti-Semitic, I'm not so sure. It's interesting that in the curriculum of what people read, they rarely, if ever, would read the prioress's tale. That wouldn't be part of an education, school education.
Amir asks, how do we Jews break this millennial cycle to us successfully?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that. Could you say it again?
Amir asks, how do we Jews break this millennial cycle to us successfully?
Oh, I don't think we do. I would like to think we would. I would like to think in a rational world that these ideas would disappear and dissipate, but the reality is that it doesn't seem to go away. It just metamorphoses into a different form. Famous stories or the famous development and history of anti-Semitism shows that it's a metamorphosis. So as much as I would like to hope that it would disappear, it doesn't seem to be happening. Does anti-Semitism disappear? I don't think so.
Sharon Luke shares, my grandfather witnessed his father being murdered at the Kishinev pogrom.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Vivian Amar asks, in your opinion, why this hate? Is it jealousy of the Jews or fear of the Jews?
Well, this goes all the way back to the origins of anti-Semitism. And as we would need about 4 or 5 hours at best to consider it. The very element of blood and the hatred of Jews is often perceived and understood as coming from the very Gospels themselves. That the words which are written, especially in Matthew, in certain sections, and dealing also with blood guilt, the blood idea is there, and in the non-synoptic Gospel of John, which views Jews as the devil, that laid down the basic hatred of the Jew. And we've lived with it ever since. As one person said, the punishment for deicide was genocide. And we live with it. It's very difficult. We did have a turn in Nostra Aetate, Vatican II in 1964-65. There was an alteration when the church began to apologize for Christian anti-Semitism and say that they were responsible directly or indirectly for the Holocaust. But the origins would seem, according to many, many people and many Christian theologians and Christian writers, to be within Christianity itself.
Sharon Luke asks, was the Kishinev pogrom famous since it had publicity?
Was it famous because it had
Publicity.
Yes. As I said, or maybe I could just clarify that one. There are reasons why certain things which happen gain greater publicity at a particular moment in history than others. If the pogroms were happening at the time of war, say during the First World War, they didn't tend to get much publicity because there was a war going on and people were being killed all over the place. Kishinev was outside of the war, and it was just that Chaim Nachman Bialik was one of the greatest of poets who wrote a particular word known as al-hashchita, on the slaughter, and his depiction of it was so immense that it couldn't be ignored. And that's why also, because as I said, that America wrote about it and got involved in it, and people from all around the world were abhorred that which went on with the Jews. So it was a matter of it just took place at the right time, at the wrong, or the right time at the right place, or the wrong place at the wrong time. That was the reason why it was so well known.
Eva Waldman asks, some commentators have said that the idea of blood libel is being used today in regards to Gaza. Any opinions on this?
Well, I would like to stay out of modern politics, but as I mentioned, it certainly has been dragged into the political situation of the particular war going on at the moment. And even we see in Britain where cartoons in newspapers have often depicted Netanyahu in what many people would perceive as something which was anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, and somehow and given over to blood libels. So it does get dragged into where Israelis are accused of taking the victims' organs in order to harvest them and use them for Jewish kids in Israel. It's all nonsense, of course. But unfortunately, but if you read the literature, which is a separate subject, but if you read the literature, which is in Arab literature, in, as I've said, many of the Arab countries, the idea of blood libels is continuous, doesn't go away at all.
Amir asks, how have Jews ever been a physical or otherwise threat to these nations when they are useful service givers to that nation? Have Jewish minorities in history ever overthrown or threatened to overthrow that nation?
That's a big subject. No. Simply put, no. The Jews have not ever been in a position to be, when you talk about over the last 2,000 years, when we were in exile, as it were, then there has never been a time when Jews would be in a position to dominate the majority population. That wouldn't have been so. And we have, because we're a minority and because we were oppressed in a way, we had and still have maybe the moral high ground. We never did anything like that because we were never in a position to do that. So I would say to that, in general, the answer would be no.
Shelley Shapiro asks, in Canaan or Egypt before the Torah, did the king or priest drink the blood of the defeated enemy king as a way of showing their victory? Would that explain why the Torah railed so against eating blood?
Well, this goes back to antiquity. The Torah saw that in a pagan societies they did drink blood, and this is considered by many of the rabbis from Maimonides, Nachmanides, and many of the others against they would explain that's why the Torah is absolutely against the drinking of blood in any way whatsoever. So although blood was part and parcel of the sacrificial rite, the consumption of it was absolutely forbidden and has always been so.
Judy Simov says, Jesus was a Jew. Why doesn't this neutralize the prejudice?
Well, because we know he was a Jew, but the imagery of crucifixion is rather powerful. And as that was used when Christianity was established by Paul, after Jesus was dead, of course, you lay down certain ideas, you put forward certain concepts. You could say what we like. We can say Jesus was a Jew as many times as we like, but it doesn't change the attitude towards Jews. And it's still, in a way, is construed. I didn't go into it, but there is desecration of the host. You know, how Jews were accused of stabbing the wafer, which is used in the Eucharist. So that was all part and parcel of it, as if when we stab the wafer, which represents the body of Christ, we were somehow causing it to bleed. There's a strong, worthwhile reading up about it. That's to do with the desecration of the host.
Shirley Marks makes the comment, surely the story of anti-Semitism goes back to the story of Esther.
Well, you've now moved into biblical history, and we have to be careful when using terminology that it applies to today. You're absolutely right that there is contained within the book of Esther, the book of Esther which we use, the Hebrew version of it, what's known as the Masoretic text, contains within it many lines. There is a people who dwell alone, and you know, we don't like him, therefore we're going to kill all of them. It does contain lines which would be very useful to be used as anti-Semitic tropes. That certainly exists within the book of Esther.
Naomi asks, how would you define the riots in the pre-state of Israel, in Chevron, Yaffo, etc., for example?
I'm not certain that these would be described as within the subject matter that I'm dealing with as blood libels or ritual murders.
Okay. Kathy comments, my family lived about an hour from Kishinev. They all left after the pogrom. Some of the family came to England, some to the USA, and some to Canada.
Yeah.
And James Levy asks, was the preparation of matzah such a mystery that people didn't know how it was made? Could they not see that the matzah color was not red?
Well, of course, because what we know and what we state as logic doesn't interfere with the irrational and the non-rational concept of those people who want to oppress us and hate us and can believe anything of us. There are different attitudes towards what Jews did. So, for instance, for those people who go searching for their chametz and they go around the house with, I don't know, with a feather and a candle looking for bits of bread, which is an interesting custom. There were periods of Jewish history where that was not advised, especially if they had non-Jewish maids, because they may think that we're doing something which is rather obscure, as form of white magic or whatever. And the same thing when I said about that we accused of stealing the host using the Eucharist and stabbing them to cause them to bleed, like we would call Jesus to bleed. It was discovered that they were hosts which were just merely went moldy, and they produced a bacterium. You can read about it again, that produced a bacterium which had a red color. Logic doesn't come into it. It's unfortunately, we can shout from the rooftops, but people who want to believe nonsense will believe nonsense.
And finally, I have many comments here from our listeners thanking you for this presentation. And I'll sum it with Martin Smullen says, outstanding presentation of a terrifying and despicable subject, so much part of all our history, past and present. Thank you so much, Charles, for speaking with us today.
And I look forward to seeing you next week when we'll deal with the issue of trials of the Talmud, which touches on much of what we've been dealing with, and yet more so.
Thank
you
you
very
so
much.
much, Charles. We so appreciate you. Thank you, everyone. Good night.